Hello and welcome. My name is Sebastian Heath, and I am a clinical associate professor of computational humanities and Roman archaeology at New York University's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. And it is my pleasure today to introduce the next speaker in the Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies. And I would like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Anna Dunch for their support in imagining and bringing these videos to life. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of advanced PhD candidates, and we are particularly excited to gauge approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. And I'm very excited to allow an opportunity for our speaker today to bring his own voice and perspective. And in this video, we will hear from, and then I will speak to Nicholas Aherne. Nicholas is in his final year as a PhD researcher at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. His thesis is the first catalog and analysis of sarcophagi and coffins of Roman Phoenicia and focuses on their role within funerary customs. Before his PhD, he received a BA in classical civilization from the University of Warwick and a master's in classical archaeology from the University of Oxford, where he specialized in the material and visual culture of the Hellenistic and Roman East. Nicholas is also publishing papers on Roman domestic space and religion at Dura Europos. After his PhD, Nicholas seeks to pursue a postdoc in funerary or religious material um, with the incorporation of digital methods, such as 3D modeling and visualizations to aid in analysis as well as conservation, public engagement, and teaching. Nicholas, the screen is yours, and we look forward to what you will say to us, and then I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sebastian. Okay, so as you said, my PhD thesis is on sarcophagi of Roman Phoenicia. It's entitled Encoffined Bodies, which from the very beginning centralizes the role of a sarcophagus or a coffin as holding a body, which seems very straightforward, but this isn't often the way that they're studied in Roman sarcophagi studies. So I thought it would just be useful to get our geographical bearings, as most people studying the Greco-Roman world are studying regions a little bit further west. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see present-day Lebanon in yellow, which roughly corresponds to my region of Phoenicia, which you see on the right-hand side. You can also see that most of my data comes from these red dots along the coastline, so urban centers. Most of them come from Tyre in the bottom. Let me just get my laser up from here. And then Sidon, Berytus, and Baalbek further inland in the Bekaa Valley also yield about 100 or so each. So my data set is quite large. It's roughly 1,250 sarcophagi of stone, lead, terracotta, and wood. So I've just hit about 1,000 sarcophagi recently. And they're dated mostly to the second and third century AD stylistically, although reuse continued well into the seventh century AD. So for some of the sarcophagi, they yield a really high number of skulls. The highest number I have is 38 in a single sarcophagus. And when you look at the funerary landscape or the general landscape of Phoenicia, it would have been transformed in the second century AD when these sarcophagi started being produced and consumed, which changed the way that the living and the dead interacted with each other. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that soon. One of the methodological approaches I take to my material is a very holistic approach. So I already alluded to the fact that most of the time in Roman sarcophagi studies, the body itself is neglected. That's largely due to the fact that we often lack good documentation on the osteological data. I also face challenges in this, but to the best of my ability, I'm combining the material, the shape, the size of the sarcophagi, also the color, so the color of the stones, color of paint that rarely survives nowadays, and the decoration, both figural and ornamental elements, inscriptions, which mostly date to later phases of use in the 5th and 6th century ADs by Christians. And then when I can, I incorporate human remains, grave goods, and also the spatial setting is really important for me, especially when I conduct iconographic research. I'm really interested in how iconography was actually experienced in original archaeological contexts. These are my main research questions. So the broader question is, how can we use these sarcophagi to shine light on funerary customs, values, and beliefs of Roman Phoenicia? The quantitative question that I'm asking of my large data set is to what extent was were the sarcophagi designs dictated by empire-wide trends, so things that were already happening in Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, versus distinctly local demands and values? And then this is uh, my favorite question, my qualitative question, which is not just how do the sarcophagi represent the deceased, but how are they actually capable as material agents of stimulating emotions, thoughts and contemplations, and even real bodily actions amongst living viewers. So we'll start off with some photos of the most common decorative type, and that's largely what we'll be discussing today, the Garland sarcophagi. So on the top left, you can see a Garland sarcophagus from Sidon. It has its characteristic lion heads at the end, which are upholding this garland. And the garland was a very common motif in the Roman visual language, so it bore strong honorific connotations used for imperial art and decorated religious altars, but it also has special connotations within the funerary context. And you can really only start to understand this fully when you look at the other materials of the coffins. So on the right-hand side, we have a bronze applique of this lion head again with a ring in its mouth. And this came from a wooden coffin also in Sidon. So what would have happened in these slightly earlier wooden coffins is that these rings would have allowed people to maneuver the coffins during funerary ritual, but they also would have allowed them to hang real vegetative garlands through the rings. And when this motif was assimilated onto the stone sarcophagi and the lead coffins, you can see that the garland is also there as a representation of the rites that were expected to be performed. And this sort of symbol could cause a living viewer, a visitor to the tomb, a loved one, to contemplate their own gifts of giving garlands to the deceased and also remind them to bring those offerings. What's unique to the sarcophagi of Phoenicia, especially Tyre, is these altars, which are not just relief altars as you have in other regions of the empire, but they physically protrude, and there's a lot of space to make offerings such as lamps. So in this one on the left, excavators actually found a lamp, and on this altar on the right-hand side, there are scorch marks. So again, something would have been lit or incense would have been burned. Um, and this Greek inscription also decorates the sarcophagus on the left. So it provides us with the name of the deceased, Borostat, and that he was very good. He's well regretted. It gives his death date, which was AD 136. And it also, so this is the sort of death date that could have been marked by special funerary rituals, such as giving these garlands. But whilst most of the garland sarcophagi of the region and in the empire have the garlands decorating long sides and multiple sides as well, you can see them on the short sides. There's a distinctly local pattern in Tyre that these garlands sometimes only decorate the short sides and not the other sides. And because the garland design is replicative, so it just repeats itself, if you abbreviate it to just one short side, the symbolic meaning doesn't change at all. So first and foremost, it could have been a more affordable means um, for the patron commissioning it. But I'm more interested in the effect that that has in funerary ritual, in how people actually interacted with the sarcophagus. So if we give a lot of weight to iconographic elements, then we may expect with other Garland sarcophagi and other imperial sarcophagi that ritual practitioners and visitors to the tomb would stand or situate themselves at the long sides of the sarcophagus. And when they're standing at the long side of the sarcophagus, they can they see this elongated form which has been described as scholars as mimetic of the body. So it really draws your attention to the corpse that's inside, causes you to contemplate maybe the disturbing transformations that that corpse is undergoing. But with these Tyrian sarcophagi, it seems more likely that people would have found themselves standing at the short sides, bending down to give offerings, kneeling, sitting with the deceased, exchanging words or touching the sarcophagus. So it really would have changed that interaction. So instead of seeing the elongated form and being caused to contemplate the corpse, um, with these sarcophagi, they were becoming cult objects. Unfortunately, it's difficult to see inside most of the sarcophagi because the lids aren't removed and they're still full of human remains. But I have a couple of sarcophagi in my data set that support my hypothesis that altars were situated at the short end where the head of the deceased was. So I have a couple of sarcophagi that also have pillows on the short sides, and the pillows are on the same sides as the altars. There's another subtype of Garland sarcophagi called half-fabricated or unfinished sarcophagi, which is not always the best name for them. So this one on the right was imported from Proconnesus, and you can see that it depicts the vague outline of a garland. So this represents how a sarcophagus would look when it was, roughly halfway through the sculpting process of the imagery. And it could be shipped out to Phoenicia and finished on site by local sculptors. But in many cases, the vegetative details and other details are never fully added. They're left in this state. So it becomes a status symbol in its own right. The aesthetics were obviously highly valued. Perhaps some were painted, so I have some evidence of lime plaster and paint on some of them, so vegetative details could have been added. And what you also see is the local limestone sarcophagi emulating this, so really highlighting that it was a status symbol in of itself. Um, More interesting to me is this half-fabricated garland design from Assos, also in Asia Minor. And you'll notice that where this tabula ansata, so this inscription frame, is usually positioned on Proconnesian ones and local ones. Um, Slightly different motif is at the center here, and it's actually representing an altar in low relief because in Assos, in pre-Roman times, they used to position small altars on top of sarcophagi which were buried in the ground. So this is a really nice example of the ingenuity of craftsmen in Assos. So they were taking this pre-Roman funerary practice of theirs, adding it into this empire-wide scheme. Um, but the way that they represent it in a somewhat schematic way, and with these little additions on the sides is still loosely based on the tabula ansata. What's really nice is the little additions or handles, if you want to call them that, on the sides of the altar are reused motifs from the general garland design as well. So they come in two different types of altar representations. And I've decided to coin this term the tabula ara, so the altar tablet. And I've already mentioned that sarcophagi in Tyre were decorated with altars. So this is a really nice example of different regions in the empire interacting. So Rome, Proconnesos were using these, and other sites in Asia Minor were using this combination of garland and tabula. Um, and Sartor, then Assos transformed it. And I think that it's safe to say that only people in Assos would have been able to fully appreciate its sophistication, that it alluded back to pre-Roman customs in Assos. But it could have also had and picked up special connotations in Tyre because they were already using real altars on their sarcophagi. Um, Changing direction slightly, we still have a garland on the lid of this sarcophagus, but this is usually referred to as a mythological sarcophagus because it depicts scenes on its chest referencing the Trojan War, so specifically Homer's Iliad. And with the mythological sarcophagi, I'm often interpreting them as um, media that could console the bereaved and help them through the grieving process. So here at the center, we have Achilles, the Greek hero, who's been dragging the corpse of Hector around the walls of Troy, the Trojan prince that he killed. And on the right-hand side, we have Achilles again, who is mourning his comrade Patroclus. So Patroclus was killed on the battlefield, and this is why Achilles has gone on a rampage in Homer's Iliad for revenge, killing Trojan princes, culminating in Hector. So this is a later scene after dragging Hector's body, and he's in his Greek camp with his fellow Achaeans, his fellow Greeks. And Priam, the father of Hector, has come to plead for his son's body back so he can perform proper funerary rites. In the background, we have Thetis, the mother of Achilles, and Hermes, who's a messenger god, but also responsible for bringing the departed down to Hades. So I think that this would have been a very striking image to see Hector's corpse being dragged in this position on his back. It's mirroring the corpse within the sarcophagus, so there's a disturbing tension there between the rites that the living would have performed for the dead buried in the sarcophagus and the neglect and mistreatment of Hector's body, but also hope because Apollo has preserved the body of Hector. And then on the right-hand side, um, so these figures of Achilles and Priam both mourning can offer figures that the bereaved could relate to in their grief. So if one of the greatest Greek heroes and the greatest um, kings, rulers from Greek mythology are going through grief in unbearable ways, then it makes the living viewer feel that their load is not so heavy. And although this, as you can see already, this story is very out of order, so in comparison to the literary record, at the other side here we have the Greeks and Trojans bringing out booty that Priam is gifting to Achilles in return for his son's body. And these scenes continue on the short sides, but one of them departs from Homeric literary tradition a little bit more. So on the left-hand side, we have Achilles again, and this scene is happening before the previous scenes we've just looked at. So he's grieving Patroclus, and now he wants revenge. And in Homer, he goes off on this rampage and slaughters as many Trojan princes as he can. But here, instead, we have him seated, and he's ordering one of the Greeks to kill a Trojan prince. So this artistic adaptation, I think, is done to make it easier for the living viewer to relate to Achilles in his grief, but also paint Achilles as an honorific figure that could elevate the deceased and their status. And this is done by showing that Achilles actually had self-restraint in his actions, and he takes up this guise seated on a stool and with his hand outstretched, two fingers pointed, which mirrors and echoes distinguished stately rulers in the Greek and Roman world. And on the other short side, we have again an earlier scene. Patroclus is on his deathbed, and Achilles is mourning him. We've got a woman covering his body with drapery, and another servant performing funerary rites, preparing to clean the dead body. So this offers us, a more positive image of how to treat the dead and could have resonated with people who would have been practicing funerary rites recently, and also reminded them how to treat the dead properly. Moving from how sarcophagi could stimulate emotions and thoughts, there are also ways to hypothesize and theorize how they actually um, stimulated bodily practice. So I've already touched on this a little bit with the altars. But I like this example from Tripoli further north on the coast. We see an elite or a sub-elite woman, a wealthy woman, reclining on a kline. She's got a table of food in front of her, one servant giving her more food, and another servant playing kithara or a lyre. So this represents an idealized domestic scene, the sort of wealth or status that she enjoyed in life, or at least wants to project that image to people in death. But what I'm really interested in is this patera or fiale, a shallow dish that she's holding. And it fits in with the domestic context that she's drinking and eating, but it's a very unusual perspective. So usually when figures in Roman funerary art are holding a dish, they're holding it on top of their fingertips. But this is very tilted towards the viewer. So this is what neuroscientists would call a dynamic hand gesture. So hand gestures are amongst the most powerful symbols for the human eye and the human brain to recognize. So I would propose that being faced with this sort of image actually triggers mirror neurons in the human brain. So it makes the viewer want to replicate the image that they're seeing. And so it could have encouraged people to pour libations for this deceased woman. And also when these trigger neurons are activated, they're also intrinsically tied to emotion receptors. So you can imagine that the funerary sphere was a very heightened emotional experience. So replicating the acts of your deceased loved one, or at least seeming to, really would have brought them emotionally and intimately closer to one another. And the same can be said for not dynamic hand gestures, but implicit hand gestures. So another pretty common motif on my sarcophagi is again reclining figures holding a garland. So even just by holding this garland, this deceased woman could have triggered something in living viewers and loved ones to leave a garland at her tomb. This sarcophagus is also interesting because it highlights this discrepancy sometimes between iconographic readings of the sarcophagi and their original spatial context. So the chest is again decorated with scenes from Homer's Iliad surrounding the life of Achilles, and it wraps around four sides. So this is currently in the National Museum of Beirut. So you can freely walk around it, which is great because people can experience all the sides. Often you go into museums and sarcophagi can be up against walls, so you can't fully experience them. But when you look at the original archaeological context, you see that this sarcophagus was actually flanked by two other ones, and a free walk-around experience was impeded. So the viewer could still see most of the front side. They could see all the sides except for the little corners here, but they wouldn't have been able to experience it all in one go. So I've tried to hypothetically reconstruct an ancient lived experience here. So this U-shaped setup is what we could call a triclinium setup. So again, echoing how clini or couches would have been set up in wealthy Roman households. And it's as if the couple on top, most likely a husband and wife, are still enjoying this domestic bliss. It's also possible that, as we see further west in Rome and other provinces, that some sort of funerary feasting was taking place in funerary rites before the sarcophagi. If not, the act of just bringing food and drink still replicates that domestic experience. And this would have been especially powerful for a servant or a slave of this couple, because they would have walked into this tomb area and approached their master and mistress as exactly how they served them in life. So above them, um, in a in a in a setup that mirrors the household. There was actually a mosaic here on the floor, like we have in domestic settings, and a slave in their embodied experience is performing the exact same task fundamentally, right? Bringing food or drink dishes to the deceased. And then I may as well just touch upon where I want to take this sort of research next, but we can discuss that as well, Sebastian. Um, So I would like to employ digital methods to build upon um, my thesis in the form of 3D modeling of the sarcophagi and tomb spaces, interactive visualizations, so making aspects like the iconography and the inscriptions move, come to life a bit. And the main reason that I'm interested in this is I can show you an example here. This is a sarcophagus um, in the region of Beirut. It's a little bit out of Beirut, and it's currently in a car park. And I guess this fence is an attempt at conservation. Obviously, um, I have collaborations with some Lebanese scholars who are working on conservation goals, but there's a lot of instability in the region currently and also historically. So I found that the best way, the next step, on top of my theoretical approaches, is to use digital archaeology to enhance the scientific analysis, but also try to improve conservation methods, and also inform the public of how sarcophagi were actually experienced, and the cultural value that they have for the people of Lebanon as well. And because at the moment Lebanon is inaccessible for me to go to, that's why I may need to broaden my scope slightly, so include funerary art and archaeology, or even religious sculpture more broadly. So I'll stop there and I welcome any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview of your work. Um, I am, yes, building on a little bit of our prior conversations, but also trying to keep to the presentation today. Um, I think you talked about a disturbing tension, and I like that term. Um, I wonder. And a disturbing, right, disturbing tension between the living and the dead, and issues of the body of Hector, reminding people of death in a way that, right, possibly disturbing, but also offering them opportunities for redemption, and humans actually getting along with each other. Um, uh, is that a tension between the experience of life and death, or is there an elision between people coming in and seeing Homer and seeing Homeric stories and connecting that to their daily experience? Do you think of these sarcophagi as attempting to jar people a little bit, or are they easing their ability? And I think you've overlapped with that, and it can be both. But what are the contexts that allow people to read this or have the experiences that you think that they are having?
Yeah, that's an important question. So with most of my research, I've tried to focus on the effects that it would have because that's a lot easier to answer. But what you're getting at is the reasons behind the designs. And yeah, did the patron or did the um, sculptor want to jar someone with this image? Um, at least from my approach, and a lot of scholars of Roman visual culture would agree that um, it's a very sophisticated medium. And some scholars describing similar violent scenes in domestic spaces have referred to a sort of like voyeuristic, sometimes verging on like pleasure that Roman viewers take in dealing with death. We have um, mosaics and images of skeletons in dining contexts. Um, there's also, let me see. This is a battle sarcophagus. So I have a few battle sarcophagi as well. And you just have this piling up of bodies. The horses in particular are getting trampled and have offset jaws, wide eyes. Um, so I definitely think that there's more to it than just like status symbol or paideia. I think these sarcophagi are definitely meant to implicitly, so visually, um, yeah. invite viewers to contemplate their own mortality, and the disturbing realities of death as well. So when you have this piling of bodies on the outside of the sarcophagus, it's mirroring what's going on in the inside, right? So I said that the sarcophagi are heavily reused, sometimes as many as 38 people were buried inside. So definitely that would have, I think subconsciously the viewer would have made that connection. Um, but obviously, we've discussed before that on a third century sarcophagus like this, you like the movement in Roman art is definitely towards jam-packing space with lots of figures. So the intent in this example is not, of course, let's put loads of figures on it because there'll be loads of bodies inside the sarcophagus. But yeah, designers, patrons, I give patrons a lot of agency in making these decisions. So I definitely think uh that would have been something that they bore in mind in the design process. Did you need to push me a little bit further with that?
So the piling on of bodies, I think, I get disturbing tensions and piling on of bodies. So we have a elusive phrasings here. I do, yeah. Okay, can we push farther? And you noted the bodies on the surface of the sarcophagus, the exterior of the sarcophagus, moving into the body that's in there, and maybe it can be more than one reuse and such. You can do you can address that.
Hmm.
What is the I think this is an easy question, but trying to make it explicit, the number of bodies on the outside looking at that, what is the continuum of relationship between the people coming to looking at this? And you talked about, a slave preparing the way for the person who's coming to view it. That came out. Um, do we think of a large number of people in front of these? Have you thought about, how many people could be in your spaces and creating a sense of, yeah, the bodies on the sarcophagus are just part of the crowd, or to what extent are there? I'm trying to find the opportunities for elision and how people might have looked, or these things fall into the background. What does it mean for the role of the dead in the living, the role of the embodied marble in both of those spaces? Yeah, I am intrigued. What you're willing to push for in part, Nicholas. I note you saying, um, bringing in neuropsychology, and that is, reasonably leaning into what people are thinking. And so where are you willing to go without feeling that I or anybody's necessarily going to hold you to anything? How far are you willing to go?
Um, in terms of space, these sarcophagi didn't have a whole lot of space, especially through time as the necropolis became more crowded. Um, but sarcophagi like this, with mythological scenes, lots of bodies, really any visible figural iconography would have stood out in the the necropolis or the cemeteries a lot, because they constitute a much smaller number in the data set. And I think that although they're catering towards a smaller clientele, so just the loved ones of those buried here, I think definitely uh, any viewers in the cemetery of nearby sarcophagi, uh, people visiting Garlands or chapels in the necropolis, definitely would have maybe not as an intentionally stood before them, and try to learn from them, right? To engage in a discourse about their own mortality and fate. But they definitely would have, I think, subconsciously, at least, used them. Um, to be honest, the with the neuroscience, this is actually something that I found out after I proposed that the gesture could trigger something. So a lot of what I apply is yeah. Bit following scholars in art theory and materiality studies, archaeology of the senses. We're fortunate that we have a lot of literary sources in the Roman world that give us insights into how they handle their emotions and how they viewed them. But it's more difficult, studying Phoenicia to know how much I should map that on. I don't have access to the Aramaic sources. Um,
So Nick, I'd welcome you going back to the reclining female between two servants and
Hmm.
looking at that image in terms of your analysis of that. And I note, I don't think people can see my cursor, but the massive left hand.
Yep.
It is somewhat out of scale. It is, and without, I don't presume intentionality, but I certainly don't presume error. I presume, what should I presume? What can one presume in terms of, how do you interpret that quite large hand? And am I right that it
Hmm.
is quite large?
Yeah, it is definitely very large. It's not just a protruding hand that's closer to us. Um, so with this example, I mean, you have to take all these things into context. We're right not to just jump to um, absolute error, right? So look at the wider material context. This is an expensive marble import from Prokinesis. Um, we see deep carving that would have required a lot of time, a lot of financial investment, a lot of skill. The rest of the sculpture is pretty impressive. I think what we have here is maybe an apprentice that finished a piece of it. Um, and that's why it's so large because it's completely disproportionate to every other aspect. Um, so when I was something, important when I was making this interpretation of this triggering something is to consider um, are there any signs of a lack of skill or low skill? Because sometimes in these cline scenes, the perspective is distorted because the sculptor lacks the skill to show it um, correctly, or it just becomes a local stylistic preference. So this isn't the case apart from the hand. So I'm happy to draw those interpretations. Yeah, with the hand, I mean, the foot looks okay. It's difficult to tell from the shadows, but the hand definitely stands out. So I think we can put this down to an apprentice, maybe. Um, I wouldn't want to say, you can see even the arm is quite thick looking, the forearm. I would, some of the sarcophagi were imported almost finished, and then small details could be added on site. So maybe the portrait features were not carved in Prokinesis, but they were carved in Phoenicia, with a direct or closely indirect model of the deceased's face. But I highly doubt that local sculptures would have needed a hand model to do her hands. And what we don't want to do is equate lower skill with a sculptor in Phoenicia as well.
Is there a path to some form of intentionality, if that's the right word, through your work in digital humanities and trying to reconstruct the lighting and the experience of it? Is the hand being emphasized? I almost want to um, explore the options other than apprentice. Again, we will never know, and I'm comfortable with that. But what is I can ask in this specific instance, um, what are the lighting conditions around there? How does that affect your work? And I guess I can place it in this specific instance, but this overlaps with your 3D work, segues into your 3D work. What do you think is your ability to reconstruct the experience of looking at these outside well lit, artificial electronic lighting, whatever with electrically driven lighting with sharp shadows and such like that. How does that come into your work?
Yeah, that would be really useful. So, to be able to situate the sarcophagi digitally within a variety of contexts, right? Varying in terms of darkness and light, in terms of the tomb context that they could have been. I think some work has been done on portraits in Palmyra. So originally, um, some of the funerary portraits in Palmyra in Syria, they scholars referred to them as reflecting slightly lower skill or more appropriately, a very unique local artistic style in how they wanted to represent people. And certain features of the face, of the hands, of the body were larger than others. And subsequent scholars said, no, this is not a lack of skill or not merely artistic preference. This is to so that when they were situated within the tomb context, some of them are up very high on walls. Um, it was so that the viewer down below on the ground um, could appreciate a re more realistic perspective. And that's why those proportions were out of sync when you're just that's the problem when you're just facing museum objects, right, on your eye level, and completely out of archaeological context. So, um, that's the sort of framework that I could apply to these pieces. And if you had lots of other features that were distorted, then you could make that argument with this piece, but it seems to just be the hand, and I can't think of any original display context that would have needed such a large hand. But maybe you know what the I can't say intentionality, but what the effect of this is, you can also see that she's got her hands on a garland. So because I've already talked about how significant hand gestures are, but because the hand is so large, it draws your eye even more. So inadvertently, it could have had a more powerful impact.
I do encourage, that balance between inadvertently on the part of the person sculpting it, the patron, however it is. Um, and I find myself drawn to at least recognizing some purposeful agency in it, but that's a dialogue that we're having. So very welcome, I welcome the dialogue, and I welcome you saying, no, Sebastian, it's really just a big hand, and that's all it is. But then the subsequent viewing of it, as you say, it doesn't matter whether it's inadvertent or not. If it draws the attention of the subsequent viewer, not me, who cares about what I think, but the subsequent viewer, the contemporaneous subsequent viewer in terms of what they're thinking. Because you are right. Um, um, I think an aspect of the ancient world that doesn't always come through in our modern appreciation of it is the role of hand gesture and is the role of finger counting in commercial transactions, slightly across instances at auctions and things like that. So ancient hands were one way of communicating that hasn't entirely disappeared today. We use our fingers to communicate in a variety of ways, but the hand was a much richer channel for communication in the ancient world. So I encourage you to you're looking at the right hand and talking about the neuropsychology. So I remain interested in that left hand, obviously, and encourage you to incorporate it into your analysis, or perhaps to be clear why you're not. I think there is something there again in the impossibility of going back and interviewing people, but there are opportunities to say things. Um,
No,
uh,
thank you. That you raise a good point, and I can at least present the possibility of intentionality there, and present it as a case where if there is intentionality there, and you would expect it coming in this case from the patron and maybe the sculptor helped them get there. It really well, it's a really striking example because it completely goes against traditional Roman artistic and Greek beauty ideals. So it's a really unique case of right prioritizing ritual effect and the importance of rites for the deceased um, over bodily ideals.
and I think what you just said is important, and in regards of you having looked at this corpus, making sure that massive hand doesn't go out as representative of anything normal, and that it is unusual. So I think that is a way of saying, yes, Nicholas, look forward to you bringing this material to the world. And um, did I say this in reading the text? You're in your final year of your of dissertation,
Yes,
keep pushing and get it done. It is hard to finish, and so the community of scholars wishes you luck as in doing that. And of course, you have to be careful not to chase down absolutely everything. A dissertation needs to be defined, but I do encourage some discussion of the massive hand because I think it's evocative, and I think it's evocative in context, and especially because size is clearly playing a role on this sarcophagus. It's playing the role that it frequently plays in Roman art. The central figure is larger. We could call those children, but they look like fully mature human
yeah,
beings that are being intentionally rendered as smaller to bring your focus to the powerful person in the middle there. And this is the
exactly.
standard way of saying that. And so size matters, and that's a big hand. And so I keep to that as an opportunity. I hope that feels like a merely scratching the surface of your work, and did say you are working in extending your work to Dura Europos and to other coffins, lead and otherwise. But I hope. Yes, thank you for taking the time to present your work to me, to us. And a little bit of conversation probably reveals what you already knew, that there's just a tremendous amount going on here. And I look forward to you bringing it to the world.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you. It was yeah, great to hear your insights and at least push this case a little bit further as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. Best of luck with that. And yes, so ends this latest installment in the videos of emerging scholars. And thank you so much for joining us. Take
Thank you.
care.